to talk about basically what equine gastric ulcers are, a little bit about why they happen, which is quite a complex issue. The diagnosis. You see, I brought the scope along today, so we can sort of show you a little bit about that, and then how to manage the horses going forwards, and like Julian said, try and stop the ulcers from coming back. So EGUS, or equine gastric ulcer syndrome. You can turn the lights down if you want.
Hopefully it won't go black.
Oh, lovely. That's nice.
Is that right? I won't do any dark.
No, we don't want everyone asleep. So it's simply erosion of the horse's stomach lining due to prolonged exposure to the acid that is produced by the stomach and should be produced by the stomach. It affects 1 in 3 equines, which is quite a shocking status. You know, that's a lot of our domestic horses are affected by ulcers, and it can be any horse. I think we typically think of our thoroughbreds, our racers, and our sort of top performance horses, but it is our leisure horses as well. Brood mares and foals can be affected too. Why do our domestic horses get ulcers? Well, basically, the evolution of the equine digestive tract happened over many, many years, thousands of years, and we have domesticated our horses in a relatively short space of time. These are foraging animals. They, as much as we love them, they are designed to eat. That is what they're meant to do all day. 16 hours a day is just eat. The sedentary lifestyle, mooching around sort of plains, heather, wandering around, eating a low starch, high fiber diet. So nowadays we've domesticated them. We give them daily exertional demands, or some of us do, but you know, they're doing more than the wild horses would be doing. We restrict their feeding patterns by whatever our management may be. Most of us will have a mixture of stabling and turnout, but even those horses with 24 hours turnout, it'd be quite a restricted patch of ground that they're not able to sort of roam and browse over. And then we increase the quantity and the quality of our feed intake, which is great on one hand, but again, it's not quite how the digestive tract did evolve. So this gastric acid is secreted continuously, even when a horse isn't eating, which is why we talk about wanting our horses to continually eat, because when they don't, that gastric acid overpowers that stomach lining. The saliva, when they do eat, is based basically with bicarbonate. And thinking back to chemistry, for those who did it, of course, we have our acid, which is a positive ion. We've got saliva, bicarbonate, which is negative. You get a positive, you get a negative, you join them together, and that neutralizes. So it brings the pH closer to 7. It's not going to ever go that high in the stomach, but when we don't have that saliva neutralizing, we get a really low pH, which is what can cause these ulcers. So a much more acidic environment than the horse that is foraging and grazing for those 16 hours a day would have. So our risk factors, as I've alluded to: diet type, access to forage. For those who do feed concentrates, again, thinking more back to our race horses, those concentrates can produce quite an acidic environment in the stomach as well. I'm not going to go on too much about nutrition and food, because obviously we're going to cover that later. Any high intensity exercise, first of all, the blood is directed away from the stomach. It's directed into the muscles to allow that horse to perform, to do that exercise. So we've got a decreased blood flow to the stomach. And also we've got food contacting areas of our stomach, and it's not designed to be exposed to gastric acid. In a minute, I'm going to show you some pictures of stomachs so we can see the different parts and how they're quite differently put together. Basically, intra-abdominal pressure increases at these faster gaits, trot, canter, gallop especially, and that then splashes up the stomach and can lead on to ulcers. Stress and illness. Now, I probably have forgotten or not put down some of the stress factors that we potentially could put our horses through. Because stress it's not just a negative connotation. I think we think, oh, stress, oh, I'm so stressed, it's a negative thing. That can also, that's excitement as well, that's adrenaline. It manifests in a lot of ways. So we can have sort of stable confinement, or depending on the horse, some may find turnout quite stressful. Take our racehorse again, he's been stabled all his life, he's been on the track, and then he comes to a domesticated home. He might not have seen a field, and then to be suddenly turned out, that might be quite stressful for that particular animal. Any change in management. So for a horse, their routine is everything. I mean, I'm sure you know that your own horses are probably kicking down the door if you're 10 minutes late for the feeding in the morning. They love a routine. They're quite dependent on that. So a change in management, albeit quite small to us, could be stressful to a horse. Some horses find changes in the people they associate with quite stressful. I mean, my own horse couldn't care less as long as he's fed, but some might find that stressful to be different people coming and going. Any new surroundings, lack of company. These animals they're social animals designed to be in herds. So if they're on their own, then that can be stressful as well. And unfortunately, a lot of the things that we like to do with them could be perceived as stressful for some animals. Competitions, traveling, increased exercise could all be a stress factor for the horse. And then I've also put in here lameness, which is sort of going on to our performance issues. There's some speculation to say that 50% of horses with ulcers have an underlying lameness as well, or associated. So often pain can be a factor, and these two things can come hand in hand. So it's really important to look at the whole horse holistically to try and work out what's going on. We've also got medications as well, long-term non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. They are the ones that are most associated with ulceration. They stop the mucus layer, which is the natural protectant of the stomach, from forming, and that can also increase our risk of ulceration. So here is our horse's stomach. I wish I had my pointer, but I don't, so I'm going to go over here instead. So the stomach has a capacity of about 7.5 to 15 litres in a larger horse, about the size of a rugby ball. So compared to a horse and its whole digestive tract, that is pretty small. The esophagus leading into it is about 1.5 metres to get to that point. So in here, we've got the little opening down there. That is where the esophagus comes into the stomach. The main body of the stomach, so this lighter part at the top, this is called our squamous area. That's just the cell type. And the squamous part of the stomach doesn't have the glands that produces the acid. So when I was talking earlier about the splashback occurring with increased exercise, that's the part that's at danger of being damaged by that, because it doesn't have the glands, it doesn't have the mucus protection that the bottom part of the stomach has. So any acid flying up to the top of that part of the stomach is going to be exposed to that acid, there's a risk of ulceration. We've got the chain to the two, marginatus, nice line across, and then all of this bottom to about 2/3 of the stomach. This is the glandular region, so that's producing our acid. That's producing its own mucus, its own protection against the ulcers. Now, of course, we can get ulcers in this region as well, and we'll talk about the mechanisms and why that can happen as well. So we can get ulcers in both of those parts of the stomach. And then we've got the pylorus here. This is the exit into duodenum and the start of the small intestine. So this is it on paper. Let's have a look at some actual pictures of horses' stomachs. So often when we're scoping, people will panic as soon as they see the picture and say, gosh, what a big ulcer. No, it's fine. It's fine. This is all normal looking stomach. So this is our non-glandular stomach, the top part, so the squamous region, compared to this very dark, much darkened area, the the glandular stomach, and that very distinct line between the two, and that is normal. That's the normal looking stomach. We've just got some different views of it here, so we can see this is the scope. So that's coming from the esophagus. It's coming sort of round the corner, and then the picture we're seeing is from the end of the scope. And this is it's the lesser curvature of the stomach, small part, and then down here, tucked away in that pool, would be the bottom of the stomach, the pylorus, and going into the small intestine region. And then on the other side, there is a nice picture of the pylorus itself. So that's the exit of the stomach there, looking nice and healthy. We've got a little bit of frothy mucus on there, but that's absolutely normal as well. Our top picture is just sort of looking down a little bit more on that stomach. So all fairly normal looking stomachs there. So moving on to our ulcers, what sort of ulcers we can get and what they look like. So we'll start with these squamous ulcers. So these are the ones, again, on the top part of the stomach, splash back from that acid on part of the stomach that shouldn't be being exposed to acid. So we call it grading by the numbers, and I'll just sort of go through what that means. So grade 0 or normal, the epithelium's intact. What's the epithelium? It's the surface of the cells. So the cells are intact, and there's no appearance of hyperkeratosis. Big long word. Thickening. There's no thickening. There's no damage there. Everything's intact. It looks lovely and how it should. Going on to the grade 1. So we've still got intact cells. That's good, but we are starting to get a little bit of thickening. So these areas of hyperkeratosis forming. Grade 2. This is where we are starting to get lesions. You can see so little areas of ulcerations. You see all those darker sort of red dots spanning down that picture there. Small single or small lesions that you get sort of together, just like there, where it's covering it. The grade 3, we're starting to get a little bit more extensive. They're still quite superficial, so they're not going too deep, but they are more extensive. There's larger areas of ulceration. And then on to the grade 4, you can see these areas of, again, at the bottom of the picture, that bigger red area, that's going on to the glandular, so that's a different colour, but the area above with the paler area, those dark red dots, they shouldn't be there. That is bad grade 4 ulceration, so that is sort of as bad as we grade it really, but you can get dots that are quite small, you can get them sort of joining together, so different appearances, but it's more about the depth of that ulceration. Now, when we talk about our ulcers at the bottom of the stomach, so pyloric lesions, but can be anywhere on the glandular part of the stomach, so that bottom part of the stomach, we describe them, so we describe it as mild, raised, or flat. It can be hemorrhagic, so it means it appears bloody. Ulcerated, so that's where it is getting sort of carved away. You can see an indentation. And this word hyperemic, a sort of a reddened area, looks a little bit more angry than your normal ulcers would look. But you can see that one on the end, that's severe, that's raised, hemorrhagic. It doesn't look like a lot of fun. That's probably going to be pretty painful for that horse. Although saying that, our lesion type and severity doesn't always correlate to the behaviour of horses and how much pain they seem to be in. To one horse, a grade 2 lesion could be pretty severe. To another, they might tolerate grade 4 lesion, for example, which makes it all a little bit more complicated. So having a look at these pictures in real life. These at the top left. This is our squamous region, and I'd probably say these are grade 4 lesions, pretty extensive. They're getting pretty deep ulceration there. In the centre, we've got the glandular region. So again, down at the bottom of the stomach, the pylorus, quite raised area in the centre there, and that reddened appearance, hyperemic. We've got some severe ulcerated, sort of small, it's only sort of one large lesion with some smaller ones, but that's quite a severe ulcer as well. And then at the bottom again, bottom left, quite severe ulceration compared to the squamous ulceration on the right at the bottom, which is probably more like a grade 2, but quite small areas of ulceration there. So when do we suspect ulcers in our horses? It is really tricky to know what are ulcers and what aren't. I'm sure you've either suspected it in your horses, know people that have, or know people that have had horses with ulcers. These are vague signs we're looking at a lot of the time, from the poor appetite and get weight loss, poor condition, dull coat, those sorts of signs. Going on to the poor performance and behaviour changes, things like, it could be anything from my horse was fine tacking up and now it's a bit girthy, he pins his ears back, has a look at me when I put the tack on, walks away from me in the stable, to it outright bucked me off the other day, to now it's refusing jumps. Things like vices, crib biting is associated with ulcers. And then we get our mild recurrent colics, those that the vet may come out and treat quite successfully. It responds quite well to pain relief, but then the next day it might be grumbling, next week, and there's no obvious cause to that colic. Could potentially be ulcers. This is even more difficult to detect in foals, which can also be prone to ulcers, especially newborn foals, because they've got quite a lot of stress in their lives initially. Some of these, teeth grinding, increased salivation, they're laying down more. Again, all quite vague signs. So to diagnose it, we can guess and we can suspect, but really the only way to diagnose ulcers successfully are by using a scope. So as I said at the beginning, the esophagus, so the pipe down into the stomach, that's 1.5 meters. So we need a good 3 meters in length of the scope to get down into the stomach, be able to curve round and see everything we need. It's nice, relatively soft, flexible. We can take videos on it, and it has a light to light the way so we can see what's going on. What's great about the scope you see today, I brought it along, it's portable. I mean, it's heavy, but it's portable, so we can bring it on yard. We can do these scopes on yard, which is brilliant. We just need a sedated horse. It's relatively well tolerated, although I think the worst part for the horse is when you go through the nose initially, but with sedation it is a well tolerated procedure, all standing, relatively straightforward. We do need a fasted horse, so this means no food for 16 hours and no water for 5 hours. If you can see by that picture that I've put in at the bottom, you need an empty stomach to be able to see it. If you don't have an empty stomach, you can't see the lining. And it's amazing how often we do get to scopes, even when people have starved their horses, they pick up the bedding. Some will even eat shavings, and some horses need to even have a grazing muzzle on to stop them picking up and eating those shavings or whatever they can find. So really important for us to be able to do our job, that horse is starved, including that restriction to water. So the picture on the left, you can see the scope goes up the horse's nose, goes through the nose, and then we reach in the center picture there, that's our pharynx there. Now the large opening in the center, that will go down into the trachea, down into the lungs. We don't want to go there, so we need to wait for our horse to swallow, and as it does, we then pass the tube into the esophagus and go on down to the stomach. So this first video is going to be mainly focusing on the squamous part of the stomach, so that higher part of the stomach, which doesn't have our glands, doesn't have the acid production, that can get splashback and get problems with ulceration. Okay, so as I heard some of you rightly saying, we've got a little bit of food down here stuck to the side. So again, this is why it's so important to fast our horses. I suspect this horse was fasted absolutely fine, but even so, we still get those remnants, that food sticking to the side of the stomach. Got a little bit of probably grade 2 ulceration, just the odd lesion there. So we've got our margay plicatus, that normal division between those two parts. We've got the stomach folds, again, normal. That's absolutely fine. You can see them just moving around as the stomach contracts. But those little areas on the end, on the edge there, that's ulceration, and that's not quite right. So I'll just play it once more, because we go a little bit further up to the top of this. We sort of look up at the top of the stomach. Those darker areas up there, that's not a problem. That's relatively normal finding. Our normal food, our mucus stuck to the side, just getting in the way from us being able to visualize all the areas of the stomach, and then these ulcers just sat there between the two parts of the stomach. So that's our squamous part. This is a short video. This is going to show the pylorus. This is the bottom part of the stomach as it exits into the small intestine, the duodenum, and you're going to see it just gently contracting away, but we can also see some ulceration here as well. You see that darkened area, sort of to the bottom right of the screen, and then that red hyperemic area as well. Let's play that once more. So those reddened parts at the bottom, not what we want. That has ulceration of the glandular region. And then one more video, a little bit longer, this one. So you can see on the right-hand side of the image, when the screen clears a little bit, you might just see that scope coming in. So that's coming in from the esophagus. And we're getting an image from the front as the scope curves round. Now on that pillar that sort of runs down, that is the lesser curvature of the stomach. You can probably make out we've got some quite unpleasant ulceration at the bottom. That's quite dark and hemorrhagic areas, but all the way up that looks pretty angry and ulcerated. So again, quite severe ulceration. These videos are taken from our laptop. These are how it is as we're skirting around. They're not always perfect images. We get mucus in the way of our screen. We've got to try and find our way through the pool of water that's in the stomach. And we found our way through here, and now we've reached the pylorus, the bottom of the stomach. Again, contracting away. So this is a better looking pylorus than the last one. You can see in the sort of top right area, we've got a little bit of ulceration there. They're quite flat areas of ulceration. Sometimes in this region, you do get a sort of mottled appearance of this pylorus, and that's fairly normal. You know, we wouldn't get too excited about that. But those darkened areas, they were some ulceration there. And again, you can just see it contracting away, normal contractions at the bottom of the stomach as it passes into the duodenum. All right, so we know why horses get ulcers, we know our risk factors, we know how to diagnose them, and but how do we treat them? So it's definitely a tale of a few things that we need to bring together to try and treat the ulcers, but keep them away, so we don't get recurrence, we don't get failure in these treatments. So long-term changes in management. We talked about these horses that may be stressed for whatever reason, say They are confined for quite a few hours a day. They're not getting an awful lot of turnout. Then maybe that's something that we can address and try and get them some turnout. Ideally with friends, with buddies, with horses they want to be with. The horse that's going out eventing every weekend, well, maybe he needs to go out eventing every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks instead, and just lighten his load a little bit. It's like less travelling, sometimes even a change in location. You know, a certain yard, a certain situation may not suit that horse. Address any underlying conditions. So this comes back to our performance horse that we talked of, the whole holistic approach. So any underlying conditions, making sure that a horse is sound, truly sound, and happy and not painful in any aspect. Checking its back, getting your physios to check your horses, make sure they are comfortable, saddle fit, tack fit, all of these quite sort of basic and simple things. But for me, does your horse have an underlying lameness? It's got to be something that's addressed fairly early on in the proceedings, because if they do, you're going to get that chicken and egg situation where you're treating your ulcers, you may be clearing them up, but then your horse is carrying on, he's lame, he's painful, and then they will come back, unfortunately. And then we've got our medication. So what we as vets can hopefully help you with. So our mainstay of medication is something called omeprazole. Gastric is our licensed product. I'm sure some of you have seen this on yard or have used it. These are our syringes that we give orally to our horse, a bit like a wormer. This is our licensed product. So omeprazole is a proton pump inhibitor. So the protons are these H+ ions, these acidic ions, and so you're trying to inhibit secretion of gastric acid. So basically increase the pH, have a less acidic environment in the stomach. Like I said, Gastrigard is our licensed product to use in horses. It has, I'll go on to sort of discuss it, it has some difficulties because it needs to be bioavailable. It needs to get into the horse's system because it's an oral medication. It needs to be able to get into the horse's system and then act on the stomach. And then we've got compliance. Is the horse going to take your syringe? Are you going to be able to give the horse the whole medication? It takes about 3 to 5 days to reach a steady level in the cells that secrete the acid in the stomach. So in that bottom part, that glandular part. And you need to be giving this on an empty stomach. So before your first feed of the day, because we need to get as much of this paste absorbed into the system so it can then act on those cells. So roughly 75% of squamous lesions will heal in 28 days in a month. So that's reasonable, but still 25% of those won't be resolved. So this is why we really, really recommend repeating that gastroscopy, because you want to see what improvements have we made, how good is it, can we stop the treatment or wean the horse off the treatment, or do we need to continue this to get resolution? We've also got some other medication that we can use in conjunction. Sucralfate is a powder form, and again we mix it into a paste that we then syringe into the horse. The idea with sucralfate is that it binds to the ulcer and encourages production of the mucus, enhances the blood flow as well, so you're sort of protecting the stomach. It's given twice a day, and it's used in conjunction with the omeprazole, but it's not effective alone. You've got to use those two together. So when we've got a combination of our squamous ulcers and our glandular ulcers, that's when we use these two together. This product isn't licensed, unfortunately, so that means it's not been specifically tested in horses, but it's what we've got, and it is a useful thing to use with it. The other thing we've got that we can use and do sometimes use is misoprostol. Now this is used in humans as well. Again, not licensed for horses because it's a human product. Again, trying to increase the stomach pH and reduce the damage to that stomach lining. Prostaglandins in the stomach, they try and increase the mucus production and the bicarbonate production. Think about our bicarbonates, things neutralizing and helping to increase the stomach pH. It does come with quite the health warning though, because it does cause abortions in pregnant women. So it's not a drug that we hand out lightly, and it does need to be taken very seriously. If your horse is on mat, if you're leaving it on yard, you must be really, really careful handling it yourself, but also bearing in mind other people potentially handling it as well. And then we've got our supplements as well. So historically, there's been sort of little evidence that supplements do an awful lot, but they have improved. We've got the supplement that we tend to be stocking at the minute is a Hestevar product. What's in this? We've got some prebiotics, pectin and lecithin, and that increases our mucus production and again supports our glandular ulcers. We've got another component of it is this dried algae, and it's basically, think of it a bit like Gaviscon. It protects, it produces a protective layer and stops any splashback up to the top of that stomach. It also does contain antacids, but the problem is with antacids, they only last for about 45 minutes. And this is the main problem with some of your on-the-shelf products that you can get in your local tax shop, is that they mainly just have antacids in. So they're only effective for 45 minutes, which in the grand scheme of things isn't an awful long time. So this is why a supplement that does have the prebiotics in as well is more useful. So when do we use supplements? Now these can be useful for maybe the person who is not convinced about getting a scope, isn't sure whether the horse has ulcers. It could be worth trying a horse on a supplement for a few weeks to see if there is any improvement. Sometimes with very mild cases, it's not gonna sort out your grade 4 ulcers. But for sort of mild cases, there might be some improvement, which might then be a good reason to then go on and get a scope and see what's going on. And also, as you're coming to the end of the treatment, it's always a happy time. You know, yes, my horse is cleared with ulcers. That's great. We can stop and wean off the treatment. Fantastic. But what do we do now? We want my horse is probably at risk of ulcers in the future, potentially prone to them. What can I do to try and keep them away? And that's when this supplement can come in handy as well, as sort of tailing it off, overlapping between treatments and then onto supplements and back to sort of normal management. So coming to the end of my bit, I just thought of a few sort of frequently asked questions that we get that I thought would be worth just having a quick chat about. We get this top one quite a lot. I think my horse has ulcers. Can we just treat it and see if it's better? That's fine if the horse improves, but it's for those horses that don't improve. You don't have any sort of baseline as to how bad the ulcers were, or has it done any good, and where are we now? Have we completed our treatment? Have the ulcers gone? So I think it's always better to start off knowing what you're dealing with and the extent of those ulcers before just sort of embarking on treatment without knowing where you started. And it's a bit the same if you think that they've come back. Again, you don't know how bad they are and whether and whether then your treatment is working, or sort of stabbing in the dark, so it's less inflammation. The horse is prone to ulcers, but he's gone and injured himself. He's done a tendon or something, and now he needs to have some anti-inflammatories and box rest and things, and we're worried about this anti-inflammatory medication. As I said earlier, some of our NSAIDs, they can aggravate and cause ulcers. So what can we do about that? Luckily, we do have some medications which are selective for the areas of inflammation without affecting the stomach themselves. So it's again to do with these prostaglandins. So So basically, you want a drug just targeting the areas you want it to and not affecting the stomach region. And luckily, we do have tablets which can do that more effectively. So just have a chat to your vet, because we have things now that we can use to try and minimise this. My horse won't tolerate being syringed. He hates the wormer. He turns into the devil. We hear that a lot. So how do we get the medication into the horse? Well, it's not ideal. Like I said, the Gastrigard is our licensed product, and the sucralfate is also an oral thing. But we do, for those cases which either don't respond to the Gastrigard or the horse just isn't going to tolerate it at all, we do have an injectable form of the omeprazole. We start with a course of 4 injections 1 week apart. It's an injection into the muscle. And it is a good effective formulation of omeprazole. The problem is, it's like imagine you have some milkshake and you're trying to inject that into your horse's muscle. So it's 20 ml, which is about a syringe about that big, of milkshake, which is thick and difficult to inject, and it can be quite painful for these horses and can cause reactions as well. So it might be okay for the first couple, but quite a lot of horses do get fed up by sort of week 3 and 4 by having this injected. Often try and put it into the bottom because it's a bigger area of muscle to do, and of course that can be difficult and dangerous for some horses, so you can have those issues as well, but it is another option. And then my horse has ulcers, and I want to give him free access to the forage because that's an important thing to do, but I'm a bit worried about weight gain and laminitis risk. We associate horses with ulcers being poor condition, but it's not always the case. So we do see laminitic prone sort of fatter ponies suffering as well. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to leave that more to Katie's domain, but it's a nice sort of link into our sort of nutritional aspect.
So thank you very much to Damory for the invitation to collaborate on this evening. Really appreciate the opportunity to do so. My name's Katie Williams. I've been working at Denji for 20 years and as a nutritionist for 25 years. And I appreciate you won't know me as well as you know the Damory team. So just a little bit about what I do and how I spend my time. I do all the sort of technical support, product development, that kind of thing, legislation. And part of my role is to sit on the B2B committee. So BETA is the British Equestrian Trade Association, which you may have heard of. They do a lot with safety for things like body protectors and hats as well. The reason for mentioning that is that we do have an EGUS mark, which is very long-winded for reasons I'll explain as we go later on in terms of its name, but just wanted to highlight it because it is a mark of, I suppose, an approval for products suitable for horses prone to ulcers. And it's a good signpost in the sense that it's been independently assessed and approved by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But yeah, we obviously get asked a lot of questions in relation to ulcers, and feeding and management is integral to trying to reduce the risk and also manage your horse if it has had ulcers. And I thought this evening I'd try and use the opportunity to answer some of the 3 most frequently asked questions, particularly in the context of forage, because we have got a relatively limited time and we could probably spend all night and some talking about all the dietary elements of it, particularly if we got into the nitty-gritty of some of the supplements. But yeah, so obviously Denji is a forage producer. We primarily produce alfalfa, which we grow ourselves in Essex, some of the scenery you perhaps saw in the video in the break. But we also use a range of other forage types as well, including straw. So I thought I'd expand on how and why we use those in different ways. And also then, I suppose, the thing in the middle really is the haylage and the forage that you're either making yourself or purchasing for your horses. So we'll try and cover off some of the questions relating to that as well. But the key thing really is about trying to keep the digestive system healthy. And you know, as Jen and Julian have alluded to, 25 years ago, when I first started in the industry, we thought that ulcers was just a problem for racehorses. But actually, 25 years on, I don't know why I keep saying before it, sorry, we now know that it is a much broader issue than that. And the segue from Jen's last comment on the slide is is really what we get asked most about by the sort of owners of leisure horses. How do I feed them enough forage to keep them healthy and keep the digestive system healthy, without ending up with them getting, you know, too heavy, too fat? And, you know, obesity is a growing problem, no pun intended, in the UK in all sorts of domestic species, but in particular horses. So we're trying to find that balance between, you know, health, keeping them healthy, not getting them too fat, and then at the performance end, especially if you have warm bloods these days, they can be very good doers as well, competing at really high levels. So even event horses that have a warm blood element to their breeding, despite all the work they're doing, we're still struggling to keep weight off. So we'll talk about some of those things in a bit more detail as we go through. The reason for this slide really, and I always try to include it in presentations, is that the horse is a relatively under-researched species. When you compare it to lots of other different animals in the world, we don't have a lot to go on. So I have got some references, so I apologise if some of the slides are a bit wordy, but, you know, we're trying to, I suppose, up the credibility of our profession in terms of evidence-based. You know, why are we making these recommendations? It's all very well me coming here to say, yeah, you can feed straw or whatever, but what's the evidence for that? So, you know, they are limited, usually in numbers, because horses are very expensive to keep and even more expensive to do research on, but what we do have, you know, we're here to sort of share with you as sort of evidence base for the recommendations we're making. And it is important that we have research for the horse, because it is different, as that sort of slide hopefully demonstrated. Its anatomy, not least in the digestive system, is different. So yes, we can take some principles from other animals and try to apply them to horses, but you know, we need to be aware of some of the sort of differences and nuances really with the horse. So what do we know about chewing? Well, basically, if you start feeding these very highly indigestible materials, so things like hay, allowed to grow to maturity, it's got a lot more indigestible material because that's what keeps a plant upright, so it's more structural fibre. That takes more chewing and more effort. And the studies that have been done show that if you're feeding these sort of indigestible forages to your horse, they are using a bigger range of movement of their jaw, and there is a direct correlation between the amount of pressure they're using and the amount of saliva they produce. And Jen talked about the importance of the saliva for the bicarbonate. So the more saliva we can encourage them to produce by just feeding them these indigestible forages, the better. What we know when we get to the stomach is that, you know, it's rarely empty, and, you know, Jen talked about this, and other vets say the same things. It's amazing what you'll find in the horse's stomach, even after a really prolonged period of time of fasting. How much weight is actually lost from a horse's digestive system in the time we did this actually as a bit of an experiment. We weighed them the night before, so we have the portable weigh bridges, took them to a local vet practice. We're based in Essex. We weighed them the night before. They were withheld forage for a scoping, which they were having done anyway, and then we weighed them again in the morning. And does anyone want to guess how much weight? I can definitely do kilos. I can just about convert to pounds. That the horse actually changed just through not having any forage overnight. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Brave enough to? I would say there's a prize, but I'm not sure there is. I can think of one. Sorry, someone? 50, someone say it. Higher or lower, anyone? Lower. Okay, that was very challenging. It was actually around about, on average, and these were horses, not ponies, so it was around 17 to 20 kilos just in an overnight, so probably about 12 to 14 hour period. Now that's like a whole bag of feed. You know, you buy a bag of feed from the store, it's about 20 kilos. So that is what is actually sat, you know, and we've done it 2 or 3 times now, some of my colleagues that have the weigh bridges. So there's quite a lot of weight sat in that digestive tract. And that, you know, that's important in terms of benefits all the way through the gut. I think the key thing to talk about or think about when we're talking about acidity in the stomach is this sort of number 4 is that sort of magic number, that if we're allowing these horses to graze on, you know, pasture, then the pH rarely drops below 4. If we bring them off that and sort of start to withhold their forage intake, and even if we're offering forage ad lib, but it's not a particularly good quality forage, then we find that the acidity level will still drop. So I suppose to take away from this really is you can be doing everything right in the sense that you bring them into the stable, you're feeding them ad lib forage, and yet the acidity levels in their stomach can still get to a level where it's contributing to the formation of ulcers. And I was actually at a conference in March over in Belgium, and one of the researchers from Scandinavia that's doing a lot of work on ulcers, Nanna Luthersson, she's actually been taking Icelandic ponies, feral ponies from Iceland, and they're scoping them almost immediately from not being handled at all, not having any human contact, and they will have ulcers. So it is something that's inherent in these animals. As soon as we sort of stress them, or perhaps their grazing isn't particularly good, there is the chance that there will be ulcers there. So we're all obsessed with ulcers and have become more so over the last 20 years. And sometimes it doesn't matter how good our management is, there's a certain inevitability about their presence at times. So in the small intestine, we know that horses are not so well adapted to high starch diets. So this is a sort of highly magnified image of the little villi that stick out from the sort of lining of the intestine. They're there to increase the surface area and increase absorption. And we know that if we feed starchy based cereals, or that acidity that the starch creates will actually shrink the size of those villi. Now, we've known that in other species for a very long time, and finally we're actually getting some work coming out of the US to show that the same happens in horses. So, less is definitely more when it comes to starch. There are some scenarios where we might want to put that quick release energy into our horses, but the vast majority, and certainly of leisure horses, do not need hardly any starch at all, and probably no starch, quite frankly, to fuel the work that they're doing. So, and even if you have a poor doer, there are ways we can put better quality energy or calories into these horses without increasing the risk of problems like ulcers. And it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the gut, because these are really just making the point for why fibre is so important, and then we'll look at the forage types and how we achieve this, because until we understand why it's so important to the digestive tract, got a mind of its own, we don't perhaps take away quite so much what the importance of the fibre is until we understand what impact it has in the digestive system. So in the hindgut, we're relying on that microbial population to digest fibre. They do so by a fermentation process. If any of you have ever done home brewing, you'll know if you ferment something, you get heat given off as a byproduct of that. So it's helping to keep the horse warm from the inside. And if you go into, increasingly we're seeing these very hot summers, horses will naturally start to back off the amount of fibre that they're consuming. We've historically come across it more when we're working with these horses competing in hot climates in the Middle East, these endurance horses in particular, where they will start to limit their own fibre intake to try and regulate body temperature. And increasingly, if we're trying to compete horses in the extreme heat that we've seen in 2 or 3 of the last sort of 4 summers, we need to bear this in mind. Horses will start to reduce the amount of fibre they're consuming. We also know that it's important not to make these sudden changes to the diet. If we overload the capacity of the small intestine to absorb that starch, then it comes through into the hindgut, and that's where it can cause other problems. The debate is on as to whether colonic ulcers, so ulcers in the hindgut's an issue or not, but we'll save that for another talk on another occasion. But those bugs are also very important, those microbes, because they are breaking down fibre, and as they do that, they actually produce things like B vitamins. So that's needed. The most common one, I guess you're probably all familiar with, is biotin, so it's helping improve your hoof quality, but it's also B12 and things like that, which are involved in energy metabolism. And this is where your eye is your guide. You look at the horse from the outside and it can give you a good indication as to how healthy the gut is, because if the hooves are poor, the coat's dull, they're not performing very well, it's a good indication your digestive tract isn't functioning, and certainly the microbes within it are not functioning as they should be. And I think it's also interesting that the horse has a really high number of lymph nodes relative to humans. So the lymph system is basically clearing the sort of byproducts of energy metabolism and sort of any sort of disease or issues that it's got to clear if it's triggering the immune system that involves the lymph system. And quite a lot of these, or I think it's half, isn't it? I'm just comparing my notes. are in the ascending colon. So yeah, 4,000 to around 8,000 are in that hind gut. And if you aren't feeding enough fibre, because the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump, it relies on sort of pressure, so movement, and the peristalsis, the movement of the gut, is helping to clear the lymph system and make it function. So the nodes, pressure builds up, the movement and all the other the horse's actual movement and the movement of the gut is helping that pressure to build up and push the sort of fluid and things through the lymphatic system. So peristalsis, having that constant flow of fibre through the gut, is important for so many different reasons. What goes wrong if we don't feed enough fibre? Well, we're going to talk about ulcers in a minute, but we also have the issue of leaky gut syndrome. So again, sort of that mucus layer that you can see, the sort of grey, sandy, beigey colour, is the mucus layer. Now that mucus has carbon in it, and that's what the bacteria will eat if we don't give them any fibre. So they'll get their energy source from the mucus and erode it. So the layer becomes much thinner. And as you start to erode that, then you're compromising the cells, the lining of the gut beneath it. And then we have a more permeable gut. And you can start to see where the potential link with problems like laminitis is. You know, we know we've got to feed plenty of fibre because we want a healthy gut. We want an impermeable gut to things that shouldn't be passing through it. And as soon as we start to reduce fibre intake, we're increasing the chance of this sort of leaky gut syndrome. But this is where we start to get into this dilemma. We know fibre is important, but how much is enough? Okay, and I'm sorry for the wordy slides. If anyone wants a copy of them, they're welcome to leave their email and I can send them along afterwards. But effectively, over the last sort of 15, 20 years, you'll see that the recommendation starts to increase in terms of what the minimal dry matter intake of fibre should be. So back in 2010, a paper was published where they actually said you could go as low as 1% of body weight in dry matter. And if you think back to your BHS or your pony club exams, we used to have that sort of 50-50 ratio for horses in hard work, 2% of body weight, half of it's concentrates, half of it's fibre. And that sort of fits with this kind of 1% minimum intake. But when you read that study, there's actually no reference at all to gastric health or digestive health. They just measured things like how behavioural categories, so how much time the horse spent eating, resting and playing. So as we've gone on and as we've understood more about gastric ulcers, and then it starts to come up to 1.5% dry matter. So an extra, that extra 0.5% is another 50% on what we were feeding. And it's interesting now that, certainly that's a level that nutritionists would work to. And we're talking about the long-term management of these horses. So yes, if you need to take some drastic action to get weight off your horse because you've got an issue with laminitis or an obesity case with EMS or PPID or some reason that you really need to take them below that level, you need to consider it for the short term. And interestingly, in human nutrition as well, short term is up to 12 weeks. Once you get past that 3 months, you really need to be returning them to 1.5% if you possibly can without them gaining too much weight, because otherwise we start to really compromise the health of the digestive system. Okay, so yes, it gets a bit confusing when we're talking about as fed versus dry matter, but that's what nutritionists and feeder lines and things are there to help you with if you find it confusing. But essentially, it's understanding that we should be getting to a minimum of 1.5% on a dry matter basis. So this takes us along to, can I safely feed straw? How many people in the room struggle to keep weight off of their horse? So you have a good doer, overweight, obese, that kind of thing. And how many people have underweight where they struggle to put weight on their horse? Yeah, so definitely the minority, okay, are the ones that are dealing with the underweight horse or pony. Now, straw has been used as an ingredient in horse feeds for decades, okay, in a chopped format. It's probably been dust extracted to some extent, but it is part of a repertoire or range of ingredients that we have available to us. But there does seem to be a bit more of a stigma to trying to use it as a forage source, perhaps alongside or instead of your hay or your haylage, which doesn't necessarily stack up. Now, I will obviously start by saying, if you have a horse with a history of colics, impaction colics, poor dentition, this is not perhaps an ingredient for you, all right? But in terms of the fact that a lot of horses will eat their beds. A lot of horses have straw in a chopped form in their bucket feed and have done for decades. We shouldn't dismiss straw. And the reason that we shouldn't dismiss it is that it gives us fibre, really indigestible sources of fibre that are very low calorie, and it means we can put more into these animals that need fibre. They need to satisfy their need to chew, as well as all the other benefits through the digestive tract. So we have some studies that support the use of straw. The one that tends to get talked about, unfortunately, is the one from Scandinavia again, which is Nanna Luthersen's work, where they feed a lot higher levels of straw. Okay, the sole or majority forage source in horses was in this study. There was an increased association with ulcers, but it was the only forage they got, no pasture, no nothing, or it was the majority of the forage they got. And recognizing this sort of that, how useful straw could be, we've had recently some follow-up work, again from Scandinavia, and they've used 50% wheat straw to replace haylage and had no ill effects on looking for ulcers specifically. Okay, so we're starting to see some evidence that actually straw is fine to use, even in the context of ulcers, as long as it's up to 50% of the ration. What is exciting for me about that particular study, is that they showed when they added straw to the forage ration, and this is to animals that had normal sort of insulin responses, they weren't insulin dysregulated, then there was actually, in the evening, it took them so long to eat their forage that actually there was no significant increase at all in the insulin levels in response to eating that forage. Which, if you do have an EMS case, a PPID, or some animal that is insulin dysregulated, that is a huge benefit, because if you slow them down eating their forage, that they don't have that response, that exaggerated insulin response, you are halfway to reducing your risk of laminitis, or I would say perhaps even further to reducing your risk of laminitis happening. So this is why it's so useful as a piece of work, because there weren't any ulcers, it was 50% of the forage intake, and we saw this reduced insulin response to eating. Why would we want to use it in the bucket feed? Well, again, when we look at the rate of intake, what we're trying to do is slow these animals down as much as we possibly can. And this is some very recent work published to show that if even feeding, and this was a balancer, so it's equivalent to like a low calorie balancer, something we would consider one of the safest options for feeding to horses that are insulin dysregulated. So an EMS case, PPID, etc. But even on something like a balancer, they had an exaggerated insulinemic response when they were fed those sorts of feeds. But the key takeaway from that is these animals are consuming that meal in 10 minutes. Okay, it's very rapid. It's a meal. This horse is designed to eat for 16 to 18 hours of every day, very, very, very slowly. It's not designed to eat meals. So it's no wonder really that if they gobble their allocation up in 10 minutes, that you're going to see that response. So peak in glucose, peak in insulin to deal with that. And that's what tends to cause us problems in the context of laminitis and so on. So again, by putting straw into the bucket feed as well, we're actually slowing them down, and it means we can give them their balancer or their supplement to balance the ration. They still need all those vitamins and minerals to keep them healthy. So we've got some evidence to show that straw is really useful as a forage source, so partial hay or haylage replacer. And we've got it to show that it's going to have a benefit in the bucket feed as well. So hopefully, key takeaway is you can use straw. Why you would want to use it is it's going to have a huge reduction in the amount of energy that your horse or calories is consuming. So we did some calculations, very basic things. We took an average hay, whatever that might be, but in terms of its energy value, an average hay, we replaced a third of it, so less than what you could go to with straw, and you're achieving about a 16% reduction in your calorie intake. Now you imagine if you're replacing an even better quality forage, so in that study they used haylage, and you replace up to 50% of it, you could be reducing your horse's energy intake by a quarter. that is huge when you are really struggling, especially some of these horses that plateau. You get some weight off, and then whatever you do, they never seem to lose any more weight. You know, we get it all the time. Horses are living on fresh air, etc. Well, actually, that's because you've got to feed them a certain amount of forage. You know you want to feed them forage because you want to reduce the risk of ulcers. And here's the reason that you can start to introduce some straw. What straw should I use? Well, that's another another debate, but I would suggest that oat straw tends to be #1 choice. As you saw in that Scandinavian study, they don't grow oats very much in Scandinavia, so they use wheat straw all the time. And then barley would be your third choice. But, you know, as with anything, introduce it gradually. You know, allow your horse time to adjust to it, and you might only need to use 10 or 20%. You don't have to go as much as half it. That's sufficient to get the weight off your horse. You can soak it, you can steam it if you're worried about the hygienic quality of it. But you know, we've been doing some trials with our local college, Bristol College in Essex, and we did find a lot of variation both between and within horses in terms of the amount of extra chew time. The data's just coming through now, so we will start to share more on it in the coming weeks. But if nothing else, if they even just spend more time sorting through it, picking the straw out, spitting it out on the floor because they don't like it, you are, by the very nature of putting it in there, slowing them down, and we're prolonging the amount of time they spend eating. Okay, so can I safely use haylage? Well, my first question to anyone that's asking that sort of thing is it a true haylage? Because actually, more accurate definitions of most of the wrapped forages that we see these days would be wrapped hay. And again, apologies for a slightly complicated slide, but if you take the yellow column out, or the yellow highlighted column out, if you look at the other three, they were all forages taken from the same field, again in Scandinavia, because that's where all the research seems to come from, on the same day. So we're actually eliminating some of the variables. What we find is obviously wrapped forages tend to be harvested slightly earlier. So you tend to get a more digestible grass. It's going to be more nutritious, basically. The later you leave your forage, typically, the less digestible and the less nutritious it becomes. So that's why this study is interesting, because they took, as I say, not the yellow bit, but the other bits all on the same day. So we're just literally comparing the way it was preserved or conserved, and using that as our sort of variable, if you like. So with a true, really wet forage, silage, so generally what we're more likely to feed to a cow, the dry matter is very low, so it's only 30% structure, the 70% is water, and you're getting a proper fermentation. Okay, so lactic acid, that's your marker of how much fermentation has gone on. The more that comes up and the more your sugar level goes down, which is the WSC value, that sugar has been fermented and turned into the acid. Okay, so that is just what's happening when you wrap it and make it airtight. When we get it to what I would call a true haylage, so around about 60%, so 57.7% dry matter, okay, the amount of fermentation is reduced. So your acidity level is not as high as it would be in a true silage. And then when you come to the hay, obviously we're taking the moisture out because we're drying it to conserve it. So you've got no acidity there whatsoever. Now, the column in yellow, or sort of highlighted in yellow, is the data we do collate from customers when we analyse their forage. And these come in usually defined or labelled as haylages. But you can see the dry matter is basically 70 to 80%, very close to being a hay. For whatever reason, it tends to be what we like is these sorts of drier wrapped forages. Farmers, and maybe it's the weather conditions that we're faced with, but those producing that forage get it much drier. But you can see there's hardly any fermentation going on at all. Okay, so these forages are not acidic, not in the same way that a true haylage would be. Hence my question, really, if someone says, can I feed this haylage? Well, is it a true haylage, or actually is it a wrapped hay? Because if it's quite soft and been harvested relatively early, but it's so dry that it hasn't fermented, there is, you're not putting a more acidic forage into your horse. So when we're thinking about ulcers and increased acidity, that would mean that wrapped forage is actually fine to use because it's no more acidic than a normal hay would be. And in actual fact, it might be a little bit softer and therefore a little bit kinder. So if you are having a dilemma, and if you have got a sports horse, competition horse that you're trying to compete and you want a clean forage, test your wrapped hay or your wrapped forage, and if it is closer to being a hay, we can look at the acidity levels. It's not very expensive to do, relatively speaking. There's no reason why you can't use it. And again, just to make the point, because I think it's interesting how these definitions of these forages are distorting even in some of the published work that we come across. This was an example of a forage taken from a published paper looking at the suitability of a haylage for in the context of an EMS case, like potential laminitis. But you can see there the haylage, so pooled haylage, had a higher sugar level than the hay did. Unfortunately and frustratingly, there wasn't a measure of fermentation. So we can't see whether it was actually fermented, but for a forage to have that level of sugar, so it's not the haylage, it's not the conservation technique that might be increasing the risk of laminitis in that paper. It's just the presence of lemon sugar. But anyway, that's my bugbear. So hopefully we've ticked off you can use straw safely up to about 50% of the ration. Test your wrapped forage, and if it isn't acidic, no reason not to use it. What about alfalfa? Well, studies back in the 2000s, again, really coming out of the US, because that's where they grow and use a lot of alfalfa, typically as an alfalfa hay rather than a chop form. They were attributing the high sort of abundance of calcium, magnesium, and the sort of protein in alfalfa as acting as a natural buffer to acidity, and therefore found some benefits to using it, particularly when they were putting a lot of cereals into these elite race horses, so trying to counter some of the acidity that's produced by digesting those cereals. And we all are aware, I think, that it has an energy value. So when you look at it on face value, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because you can actually supply energy to a horse that, if it's in work, requires some, without having to use starch, because alfalfa as a plant has a very low starch content. I find it interesting that it's one of the few plants that actually stores surplus energy as starch in its roots. So it's there, it's a plant photosynthesizing, producing sugar, and when it's produced more than it needs for growth, it stores it, but it does it underground in its root structure, the bits that horses don't eat. But it may explain why why it's so good for the soil, because there is an energy or a carbon source for things that are in the soil. Anyway, moving on from that, we know that it's an energy source without the starch value. So where does the concern come from about using alfalfa for horses with ulcers? And there has been one paper published, again, small numbers, looking at the incidence of ulcers and foals. And they used the weaning process to induce ulcers, because ulcers often happen, as I think Jen alluded to, in these stressed foals. And they compared groups, again, German research group, they compared groups fed alfalfa chaff or alfalfa pellets or hay. And they were comparing sort of rations. So these animals were not just getting alfalfa, they were also getting a high level of oats. I think 2.7 kilos constitutes being a high level of oats, soybean meal, and they were also getting a high level of alfalfa, so 3 kilos. Now, a round bowl stub scoop holds around, if it's heaped, about 500 grams. So that's a huge amount of feed, generally speaking. And the calcium content, because the chaff, I would suggest, was perhaps wasn't the best quality being produced in Germany, was about 40% lower in calcium than the alfalfa pellets used. So it wasn't really a like-for-like paper, but anyway. And none of the foals actually displayed any clinical signs of ulcers, but there were some pyloric ulcers in those that were fed the alfalfa chaff rather than the pellets or the hay. So there is, an issue there. Subsequent to that, the same research group have more recently published work looking at adult horses and comparing grass and alfalfa hay. They changed the management regime 24 hours before the study to try and create problems or issues. The one horse with ulcers actually at the start no longer had ulcers when they were fed the alfalfa hay, and the authors concluded that the alfalfa hay seemed to have beneficial effects on the squamous mucosa, and there was no effect in the glandular or the pyloric region, which is where we've seen it in the foals. So to date, there have been no negative effect in the squamous region in horses of any age in any published work. Okay, the only negative finding is in these weaned foals, so therefore stressed. And I think Jen talked about quite very eloquently this stress factor and all these other issues, pain, etc., and their relationship. Yes, diet may exacerbate it, and if you are really concerned, then at the time of weaning, we would suggest using alfalfa pellets. There's been no evidence about pellets whatsoever in any animal of any age, which the researchers themselves suggest, and maybe use a chopped, really soft grass chop fibre if you are really, really concerned about foals at the time of weaning. But other than that, there's nothing published at all to show that chopped alfalfa would be any issue for adult horses, and certainly not in the context of squamous region ulcers. So it's still recommended by lots of researchers. Again, the same research group, Ingrid Vervoort, was the sort of research lead on that. She was at a conference 2 months ago promoting the use of alfalfa as a great forage source. So yes, that it's shown an element of doubt, and unfortunately it probably got a bit of traction at the time, but it's very limited, and I think it's certainly only something if you're dealing with foals to be concerned about. Some of the other positive effects that have recently been shared is Swanhall et al., the Kentucky Equine Research Group, which you're probably familiar with, KER. They've been looking at the impact of using sort of omeprazole on calcium absorption. They're using it to treat gastric ulcers. Certainly in humans, there is a correlation between a reduction in your calcium absorption. So Swanhall et al. Demonstrated the same effect in horses. They were actually using, I think, an algal source or seaweed source, I can't remember actually, in terms of bioavailable calcium to put back in the ration. And we're recommending that over and above just typical limestone flour or calcium carbonate, which is often used. So alfalfa is a great way to achieve that increase in calcium because it's naturally buffering and it's also an additional source of calcium. The reason why this is important, obviously, is if you are depleting calcium absorption, especially in an elite athlete where you've got high, sort of bone mineralization and sort of turnover requirement, young growing racehorses, then the sort of racing trainers and all that are convinced that there is an increased risk of fractures and issues when they're using omeprazole, particularly these young racehorses in training. So they are very much looking to try and increase calcium intake as a result of that. So they're the sort of 3 FAQs I wanted to make sure we answered this evening. Some of the other things sort of myths we can try and dispel, I suppose, as well, is the sort of period of time and when you should and shouldn't be offering forage to horses. There are some people talking about not using forage overnight when the horse should be sleeping, and actually is that causing more harm? And there's all sorts of things on social media that you come across. I'm never sure whether this child is extremely terrified or extremely excited, but it just demonstrates quite nicely, that the greater lengths we go to try and divide our forage as well. So we think feed little and often when we think about it in a bucket, but if we think about it in terms of our forage as well, and it's not always practical, in the real world, we're out all day, we're busy at work or whatever, school. But if we can work with people, if we're on a yard together and someone comes in later and they can put half of the forage in at 8, 9 o'clock at night and you've been there at 4 or 5, just working together to try and reduce the time the horse hasn't got forage available to it is certainly helping to reduce one of the risk factors, because certainly if we're leaving it more than 4-6 hours at a time without forage, particularly during the day, then we are increasing the risk of ulcers significantly. Now, where it gets a little bit confused, I think, is that the paper that was published did show a difference between nighttime sort of acid secretion and eating and things and compared to the daytime. But what we have to bear in mind is if we get to the yard at 4 or 5 o'clock and they've eaten their allocation in the next 30 minutes, we're sort of hardly down the drive before they've finished it, we're still in the daytime in the context of that study. It was well after 10 p.m. where they were comparing night versus day. So as I said, if you're there at 4 or 5 o'clock and that someone comes later, give them half of the ration that you were going to give at 4 and ask someone to put that hay net in or just lob it over the door, whatever you need to do to try and make sure they've at least got something in that region of 9, 10 p.m. Okay, and I think it says there 63% of the hay was eaten between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. So they still had something overnight. It's just the majority was eaten during the day. And when we're looking at risk factors for ulcers, I put this on here because I think it is quite an interesting one. There was a paper or a journalist in the US who'd come up with a sort of scheme for marking your risk factors, rating them and ranking them, and you sort of complete the questionnaire to establish how at risk of ulcers your horse is. And the researchers, I can't even pronounce that, they're Italian. Anyway, that paper was published in 2021, actually explored how accurate. So they used the questionnaire that the journalists had developed when they were scoping the horses in the hospital. And actually, I think it was pretty good. So if they came out low risk, only 14% of the horses that they'd scoped had ulcers. If they came out medium risk, it was 45%, and a high risk was 94%. So that's pretty good, I think, in terms of so we're seeing this direct correlation. We know what the risk factors are, and the more you do to reduce your risk, you are greatly reducing the chance of your horse having ulcers. We've developed one on our website. Again, I have to stress, it is not a diagnostic tool in any way, shape or form. It's just to help you try to understand what the risk factors are and the cumulative effect of that in the sense of if you've got lots of things that you're doing that is making your horse stressed or increasing their risk, just changing a few of them might actually help significantly reduce the chance of them having ulcers. And obviously the rest of the diet matters too. We can talk about things like electrolytes. We can talk about starch levels in feeds and things. The key thing to take away is that there is a recognised threshold for the level of starch that is considered to be safe in inverted commas. I think this level of starch is most definitely still having an impact on your horse's digestive health in other ways. So things like the leaky gut syndrome and the microbial population that live in the gut will be impacted before you get to these levels. But these are the threshold levels that have been sort of put out there as if you try to keep below this, you're again reducing your chances of a horse having ulcers. Both are risk factors, the total amount of starch your horse has in a day, but also how much you put in a feed. And this is where your basic rule of feeding comes in. If you can feed little and often, if you are using relatively high amounts of starch, the more small meals you can do, it will help to slightly reduce your risk. So again, if you've got to feed a starchy feed for some reason, put that third or fourth meal into the day if you can. We've talked about trying to use oil as an alternative alongside your quality forages as an energy source to reduce starch intake. So in energy terms, all oils are roughly the same. It's somewhere around 38 megajoules digestible energy. They're very energy dense, so we get a lot for a small amount of feed. But where they differ is things like the fatty acid content. So I'm sure you've all heard omega-3s talked about both in human health and animal health as well. So omega-3s are not very stable. If we put them into a hot environment, they go rancid very quickly. Okay, so things that are high in omega-3, like linseed oil, are a nightmare from a manufacturer's point of view because it either reduces the shelf life that you put on your product, or you have to use a lot of stabilizers and antioxidants, and then your costs go up. So the most commonly used oils in feeds tend to be things like soya, rapeseed oil, which is tending to be more popular as it's grown in the UK rather than destroying rainforests around the world, and corn and maize oil. Now, we don't grow so much corn or maize in the UK. So in the US, where there's a lot of it grown, that was the oil of choice used generally for research and studies. So you will still hear people talking about use corn oil or maize oil, because that was the one that actually happened to be used in the research paper. But when you read it, the rationale for using it was just because of its sort of profile, fatty acid profile, the units to make up the oil. So again, things like soya have a lot more of the linoleic content, which I've tried to highlight there from the paper, was the reason for using it. So, basically soya oil, rapeseed oil, they're all fine to use in the context of ulcers as an energy source. If you really want to go for the omega-3s, then it is things like your micronized linseed. What are the other practical ones to use? Hemp used to be used, but it's now on the prohibited substance list. You have to be a bit careful if you're competing under rules. So linseed is really the most practical one to use. I mentioned the beta approval mark. So this is the scheme that was really developed and was one of the working party that helped set it up with the approval of the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, who police medications and stop feed companies making claims that imply their products are medicinal, which is very important. So what the idea of this is to try and, a bit like the Laminitis Trust and marks for laminitis, was to try and signpost or signal people towards products that were suitable for horses prone to ulcers. So it is an independent assessment. All your marketing materials have to go to the BMD to be approved, and they have to meet a few nutritional criteria, that 2 grams of starch that I mentioned. But due to the rules that surround feeds and feed manufacturers, we can't make claims that have any sort of positive connotations for reducing, treating, preventing. You start using those words and they're things that are, rightly so, only allowed to be ascribed to things like medicines, your Gastric, etc. What we should be saying is reduce the risk of, or in the management of, for horses prone to. We cannot be claiming to treat, prevent, diseases. So it's very important that anyone with this mark does not make those statements or claims. And equally, we can't put ingredients in. So I think Jen put some of those things up in her latter slides that she would recommend. We shouldn't be doing that as feeds and attributing them to having positive benefits for ulcers. Okay, so that's where you'll see some differences. Unfortunately, the BMD take quite a dim view on supplements. As feed manufacturers, we can use this logo on feeds, but we can't put it on supplements, because by their very presentation, the BMD slightly worry about them being medicinal. So you won't see them on the Hestegard products and things like that. Okay. And we can only talk about buffering and making a natural buffer to acidity if we have evidence to substantiate it. So all those papers that I sort of mentioned, we have to have a dossier of that in case the FSA or the BMD come round and ask us to justify any claims we make. So there is some tight regulation on this, and rightly so, and it's something that BETA as a trade association take very seriously. But they are, sorry, the point I suppose I should really make about that is that they are pointing you towards feeds that have been independently assessed. So anything carrying that mark has gone through a process of being scrutinised. So when you're putting your ration together, what is your checklist? Well, access to pasture depending on the weight status of the horse. We'd love all of our horses to be grazing 24/7 on beautiful lush pastures, but I think most of us would end up with drastically overweight animals on our improved pastures. And as Jen said, sometimes if you with these ex-racehorses, retraining of racehorses is becoming increasingly popular, and we're coming across lots of people saying, my horse just gets stressed when I put him out, he's just pacing up and down the fence all day. Well, yes, the gold standard is we'd love them to be out there, but not if it's actually causing them more sort of harm and distress than being in a stable. If we are bringing them in, then we're in the territory of ad lib forage. And we are trying to use a forage that's appropriate to the weight status of that animal. So yes, straw if it's a good doer, and we can start to use things like wrapped forages for those that need a clean source of forage and where we want to fuel them for the work that they're doing. We need to balance the ration. Talked a little bit about balances. If we're going to use them, because they're very concentrated, we want to slow the horse down as much as possible, particularly if they're EMS, PPID, laminitic, etc. And we do that with chopped fibre, the straw being the ideal for making them take the longest amount of time. And if we do need to put energy in over and above what the forage is providing, then we're going to use as low starch as possible, which is things like high quality fibre and oils. Now, this is the bit I find the hardest, because with my nutritionist hat on, I should get my colleague Andrea at the back to talk about products, because it is always hard, because this is not intended as a sales pitch by any means. But if you're coming to a talk by Denji and you want some tools and some products to go away and feed, then these are the two that we would highlight particularly for ulcers. Okay, but the tummy, as you see, has, well, both of them have the approval mark. I'm not sure if the image does have it on. The idea being that they are both the sorts of things that you would use at different ends of the spectrum, but they are both relatively safe because they are low in starch. They're not going to increase the risk of ulcers or it's for the feeding and management of them depending on the work they're doing. So the healthy tummy is the slightly sort of higher, moderate, medium energy products that you'd be using for horses in work. Both have an oil coating, so there's no molasses in either of them. We're using the same combination of yeast and phosphobiotics, which again Jen alluded to, that you can find in supplements as well. We are allowed to use phosphobiotics in feeds and attribute a sort of benefit to them because it is published work. We use a blend of essential oils and herbs to try and make these things palatable, because just like for us, all the things that are really good for you and really healthy tend to be the least palatable. The healthy tummy has the vitamins and minerals added, so it is a balanced feed, whereas the Ulcer Light, which is a relatively new one, is a straight feed, so you can use it as a partial or complete forage base if you want to. It's predominantly straw based with a little bit of chopped grass, so it's very soft, and it has the alfalfa pellets in for the natural buffering. So if you want any more information, do ask Andrew or myself at the end, but that they are the key products in our range that we would suggest. And I just wanted to finish off, if any of you are thinking, oh my gosh, all these this information, all these things that I'm supposed to be doing. We did a study with horse and hounds, sorry. Can you see there? Anyway, yes, the numbers are on there, where we were asking people how familiar they were. I think we got over 650 respondents. So it was a fairly weighty, sort of substantial amount of data coming back. And there is a really good recognition for all the things that we should be doing to try and reduce the risk of ulcers. So that, trying not to exercise on an empty stomach, put a double handful of chopped fibre in before you ride if they haven't been eating their hay net or whatever. So there's good recognition of that. But for whatever reason, when we actually come to trying to do it, funnily enough, those levels drop away. And it's not necessarily that people don't want to, can't be bothered. There are other things, there are other challenges that are getting in the way, other barriers, whether it's the yard that you're on won't let you turn out for longer, or at certain times of the year. There are things that get in the way in the real world. So we are very appreciative of that. And if you are facing challenges, if you want to contact the feed line for help and advice, they will try to find ways around it for you. But some of them, like the feeding the double handful before you ride, they are relatively easy for us to implement, or exercise, or travel, I should add to that. And it might be driving, it might be, lunging, just putting a little bit in before you exercise them can make a big difference. So just to finish off, the feedline team, that's two of my team, Tracy and Claire, who have been at Damory for more than 15 years, both of them. They are the people at the end of the phone that will, or email, that will be helping you. But just to summarise, the sort of take-home messages really are, yes, you can safely feed straw, wrapped hay, to give it its true definition, and alfalfa. If we can get fibre be more of the horse's ration, I think that's the starting point. Levels in starch and sugar matter within these forages. So again, people get a bit hung up on trying to get it down to 10 or 12% sugar when they look at their hay. But actually, how quickly it is eaten is just as important. And I think we forget that. That's the missing bit in the jigsaw very often. We do go to all this effort of finding these forages that are low sugar or whatever, use these low calorie balances, and yet it's gone in minutes and we haven't slowed them down sufficiently. So if there's one thing you take away, that's key. Don't exercise on an empty stomach, that's your horse, not you. And do ask for help. That's what you get as part of the sort of Damory service. And they aren't selling you products, they are giving you advice. They talk about the forage, they talk about the pasture. It's not just about what goes in the bucket.